Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Hello and welcome to this episode of Inquests and Inquiries. Coming to you now in November 2025, this marks the release of Module 2, Report and Recommendations from the COVID-19 inquiry in the UK, noting that's the governmental level inquiry, not the devolved administration inquiries. Now, to mark that, what we've done is look at the initial responses to Module 1 by the devolved administrations, and we've asked the artificial intelligence modules within the Gemini Notebook LM to analyse them and work out what common themes there are. The reason we've done this is because Module 2 looks at the governance structures in more detail and the political responses in particular. And it would be interesting to see whether or not the pattern of responses from the devolved administrations in their letters back to the inquiry perhaps indicate some of the lessons that we then start to see in Module 2. So that's what we move on to now, and the voices you'll hear are a discussion about those letters and responses, all voiced by artificial intelligence actors.
Welcome to The Debate. Today we're looking at the official responses from the UK government and the three devolved administrations, so that's Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, to the COVID-19 Inquiry Module 1 report. And these responses, well, they really illuminate a fascinating and maybe even a dangerous conflict right at the heart of the UK's preparedness architecture. The inquiry was asking these fundamental questions about how we ready ourselves for whole system catastrophes, risks that just don't respect internal borders.
Mm-hmm.
So our central question today is really all about accountability. Should the primary constitutional and practical responsibility for preparing for catastrophic risk reside centrally with the UK government to sort of mandate a unified national approach? Or must it be fully decentralized to the devolved administrations, letting them take on a responsibility tailored to their own specific constitutional settlements and, well, their local needs?
Right. And I think that tension between, let's say, centralized operational efficiency on one hand and decentralized constitutional necessity on the other, that's frankly the biggest structural headache the inquiry exposed. I mean, what this material shows is we have four separate responses, all defining their own boundaries, not one unified acceptance of who's responsible for what.
And I'll be arguing that the sheer scale of potential catastrophic risk, it necessitates strong UK government leadership. It means retaining those centralized mechanisms. I believe ultimate whole system responsibility requires a single authority, one that's capable of commanding resources and ensuring accountability across the entire system when failure's, systemic.
And I come at it from a different way. I'm going to argue that these responses demonstrate the absolute necessity of decentralized responsibility. The constitutional reality, as I see it, demands that preparedness has to be locally owned, it has to be deeply tailored, and it has to be defined by the unique administrative and societal profiles of each nation. We have to recognize the very different degrees of responsibility that the devolved administrations are asserting here.
Well, my position is grounded in the recognition that complex civil emergencies are, as the UK government response itself confirms, a whole-of-society endeavor, and crucially, that risks do not recognize borders. Now, that reality, it dictates that the response structure has to prioritize national coherence. To drive this, the UK government is committed to enhancing central support by, for example, establishing the National Security Council, Resilience Cabinet Committee, and strengthening the Cabinet Office's role in coordinating it all.
But those are all mechanisms for coordination within Whitehall, aren't they? They don't really solve the core issue of who owns the ultimate liability outside of Westminster.
But they have to own it. The decision to retain the lead government department, the LGD model, for catastrophic risks, well, that ensures that ultimate accountability sits with the body that has the best understanding, relationships, and mechanisms for delivery. For these high-impact, low-frequency events, like a pandemic, central support is vital for that cross-system coordination. The UK government is accepting responsibility for the integrity of the whole system, across all four nations.
I see why you think that clarity of command is necessary. I do. But the DA's responses show they're defining their roles not based on the UK government's operational preferences, but on constitutional foundations. The Welsh government, for instance, it explicitly adheres to the established principle of subsidiarity. And this is the idea that decisions should be taken at the lowest appropriate administrative level.
Sure, as a principle.
Right, but it's not just a preference. It's a commitment to localized responsibility. And even more definitively, the Scottish government explicitly states they have not adopted the lead government department model. So they aren't just adapting the central model, they are structurally diverging. They are asserting that preparedness within their devolved functions is fundamentally their responsibility.
But that structural divergence, that leads directly to our first big contention, doesn't it? The retention of the LGD model. The UK government argues that an effective response to high-impact, cross-border risks requires clear accountability vested in a specific body. I mean, if we have a catastrophic national event that requires, say, military support or the coordination of reserved matters like border security or national funding, how can we efficiently allocate those resources if there isn't one single designated lead department that's ultimately responsible for the planning? The Cabinet Office's role is just to provide that central steering to make sure the LGDs don't drop the ball.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the operational necessity for a unified command can just override the constitutional reality, especially when the DAs have taken really serious steps to define their own internal structures, asserting that ownership. The Scottish government's new officials group, the Crisis Preparation Oversight Group, or CPOG, it explicitly will not be working on a lead government department model basis. They're prioritizing their own philosophy of integrated emergency management, which relies entirely on subsidiarity and shared responsibility, not centralized direction. I mean, that demonstrates a specific, very intentional rejection of the UK government concept of command.
That works fine for internal Scottish matters, sure, but the moment the crisis requires cross-border resource allocation or, say, procurement, which are inherently reserved functions, the LGD model, even if it's only applied to reserved matters, it has to dictate the pace. That central responsibility is unavoidable, isn't it?
Well, that assumes the DAs can simply replicate the centralized structure, which is demonstrably untrue in the case of Northern Ireland. The NI executive highlights that the role of the Executive Office, or TEO, is one of coordination, not direction. And this isn't some arbitrary choice. It's because of Northern Ireland's unique mandatory coalition structure, where every department is a separate legal entity and ministerial consensus is constitutionally required. They physically cannot replicate a structure where one department directs all the others. TEO has to coordinate because top-down direction is administratively impossible. So the UK government retaining the LGD model, well, that applies to England and reserved matters, but it can't constitutionally dictate the governments in Belfast or Edinburgh or Cardiff. The DAs are accepting responsibility for a structural definition that is entirely separate from Whitehall's design.
Okay, that's a compelling point regarding unique structural constraints, and I do acknowledge the legal difficulty in Northern Ireland. But when you assert responsibility for your own structure, you also have to be ready to accept responsibility for your own intelligence gathering. And this brings us to our second contention, risk identification. The UK government's position is that they provide the shared intelligence framework through the National Security Risk Assessment, the NSRA. This dynamic assessment ensures that all four nations are working from the same baseline facts about threats. It guarantees the integrity of the whole system.
That's an interesting point for baseline intelligence, though. I would frame it very differently. The DSs have moved far beyond merely accepting the NSRA. They've taken the much deeper responsibility of defining their own risk landscapes, asserting both intellectual and operational ownership over their environment.
How so?
We'll take the Welsh government. They explicitly commissioned a review to develop a tailor-made risk register for Wales, consciously moving away from a reliance on the National Security Risk Assessment. This bespoke focus ensures they address specific Welsh challenges, things like flood risk, rurality, distinct infrastructure, that might get generalized or just overlooked in a massive UK-wide document. And this tailored approach was validated. That Welsh register was independently assessed by the Emergency Planning College as robust and leading practice. That is the definition of taking true responsibility.
right? A leading practice register. But how effective is that register if it exists outside the centralized resource allocation mechanism? The NSRA ensures that all relevant data is shared, yes, but more importantly, it ensures that centrally funded resources like national stockpiles, high-demand equipment, major emergency funding are deployed efficiently against nationally understood threats. If the Welsh government's bespoke register flags a major, highly localized risk that the NSRA doesn't fully prioritize, yet the UK government owns the purse strings and the national procurement system, where does the real responsibility for mitigating that risk lie? Doesn't the central assessment of risk ultimately determine the ability to respond?
But the constitutional value of that autonomy is that it prevents catastrophic blind spots caused by that kind of centralized generalization. For instance, the Scottish government produces a Scottish risk assessment to supplement the NSRA with Scotland-specific information. And the NI executive developed its own bespoke risk register, the NICICR, specifically to address unique challenges like supply chain vulnerabilities because of their unique relationship with both the Republic of Ireland and the UK mainland. Those nuances might be lost in the vastness of the national assessment, but they are critical for local mitigation. The DAs are essentially saying, we know our territory best, and we are accountable for assessing the risks within it.
I acknowledge the value of supplementing the data, of course, but the UK government mandates departments to generate multiple and varied scenarios within the NSRA process, precisely to capture these regional nuances. Their core responsibility remains the integrity of the whole system. The NSRA framework ensures a unified language of risk. Local tailoring is excellent, but for a truly catastrophic multi-nation risk, strategic coherence driven by shared intelligence is paramount for systemic survival.
Coherence is fine, but it can't be used as a smokescreen for strategic conformity. Which brings us to the next structural point, strategy development. The inquiry recommended a single UK-wide strategy. The DA response was a near unanimous rejection, citing profound devolution constraints.
Okay, while the DAs clearly rejected a single UK-wide strategy, which I understand given the political complexity, a degree of strategic conformity is still operationally essential for UK-wide interoperability, especially when you're deploying assets like military assistance or mass vaccination infrastructure. This is why the UK government prioritizes joint working on a common strategic approach. A totally fragmented response is inherently less resilient. The Cabinet Office is focused on delivering a refresh of the central government concept of operations, the HMG CONOPS, which clarifies roles across the entire system.
But the DAs explicitly stated a single strategy would be unwieldy and would not be appropriate given devolution arrangements, responsibilities, and accountabilities. They are defining their own mandates. They're accepting full responsibility for their strategic response. The Scottish government relies on its existing integrated emergency management philosophy, and the Welsh government uses its established Wales Resilience Framework. They're saying, our frameworks work for us. We will not scrap them for a centralized model.
They are collaborating on joint concepts of operations. The CONOPS, though, isn't that a tacit acknowledgement that some strategic alignment is necessary, even if they refuse the political overhead of a single strategy document?
CONOPS are operational blueprints. They detail how a response will be delivered within existing constitutional boundaries. They do not dictate what that response strategy should be. The crucial difference here is that the DAFRs are using this moment to assert the legal limits of their responsibility. For example, the Northern Ireland Executive Office is prioritizing the review and update of its Memorandum of Understanding with the Cabinet Office regarding the Civil Contingencies Act. This is a clear legislative signal. They are actively redrawing the boundary lines of responsibility under the law. They're building their own house, not just decorating the UK's house.
They may be building your own house, but if the foundations fail during a national emergency, who ultimately pays for the reconstruction? I mean, if the UK government has to step in to provide emergency funding, central financial liquidity, and critical reserved resources, hasn't the central authority ultimately taken ownership, regardless of what's written in the CONOPS? The constitutional freedom to design strategy doesn't absolve the center of the ultimate financial and systemic responsibility for a collapse.
Responsibility isn't just financial, it's also moral and political. By rejecting the LGD model and the single strategy, and by investing in these bespoke risk registers, The DAs are asserting full political accountability to their own populations for preparedness. They're saying, we will not be able to blame Whitehall if our local preparedness fails, because we are the ones who define the system. That is a significant and I think an important constitutional maturation that we can see across these responses.
That maturation, however, it has to be tempered by the operational reality that the UK government's enhanced coordination role through the Cabinet Office and the deliberate retention of the LGD model for catastrophic risks, will they provide the necessary national coherence and ultimate resilience capacity. For risks that transcend constitutional borders, and all truly catastrophic risks do, the NSRA framework and clear central accountability are the non-negotiable foundations.
And I would maintain that the constitutional necessity of devolution has driven the DAs to definitively assert their independent administrative and policy responsibilities. They've rejected central structural models, as we saw with the Scottish government's explicit move away from LGD, and they've prioritized creating bespoke risk assessments, like the tailored registers in Wales and Northern Ireland. The true lesson here is that resilience has to be built from the bottom up, respecting that principle of subsidiarity and defining solutions tailored to the unique legal and societal profile of each nation.
So we are clearly left with this inherent, ongoing conflict between the operational desire for seamless centralization on one hand and the constitutional necessity of defined, devolved responsibility on the other. The responses confirm that while collaboration is improving, the tension over who owns the ultimate responsibility for preparing for the worst and the consequences of that preparedness remains sharply unresolved.
Indeed. And the key challenge moving forward is navigating this very complexity without sacrificing the strengths of either centralization in intelligence sharing or decentralization in tailored implementation. There's clearly much more to explore in how these arrangements evolve in practice, particularly as the DAs continue to test the limits of their asserted responsibilities.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.